I'm here in the European Parliament in Strasbourg and I'm joined by Emily O'Reilly, recently re-elected as the EU Ombudsman. Emily, you're very welcome. First of all, congratulations on being re-elected. That wasn't easy now to be re-elected because you came up against some opposition from the European People's Party group here in the Parliament, I think.
Well, yes, they were not supporting me, though I have to say the Irish members, the Fine Gael members of the EPP, led by Sean Kelly, the head of the delegation, were fantastic and they did support me. But no, the EPP did not support me, they supported other candidates. I think they don't particularly like an active ombudsman. There were a number of high-profile complaints that I dealt with that involved people allied with the EPP, but I was just doing my job. I think I'd have been a bad ombudsman had I not dealt with the complaints that came to me without fear or favour, and irrespective of who or what they concerned.
And one of those big high-profile people that you were looking at was José Manuel Barroso, former president of the European Commission, concerned about jobs that he took shortly after he left the presidency of the EC.
Yes, after an 18-month cooling off period, he took up a position with Goldman Sachs Bank, which, as you know, was heavily implicated and heavily criticised for its role in the financial crash on both sides of the Atlantic, particularly in relation to Greece here. And I think there was a feeling that this was not in keeping with the appropriate role for a former Commission president. So we got complaints in relation to that. Now, we weren't looking at what Mr. Barroso had done, but rather how the Commission had dealt with it. But as a result of the investigation that we did, the Commission toughened its code of conduct in relation to commissioners, because the EU is constantly facing a crisis of legitimacy, and when incidents like that happen, they fuel Euroscepticism and indeed your EU hostility. So it's very important that the institutions of the European Union, who are charged with such high tasks and values, behave to the highest standards.
To people who don't know much about the role of the EU Ombudsman, what is it that you do?
Well, at its simplest, I take complaints against the EU institutions. So that could be the Commission, it could be the administrative part of Parliament, it could be the European Central Bank, the European Medicines Agency, all of the institutions, bodies and so on. The institutions not in their political role, and certainly the Parliament not in its political role, but it's in its administrative role. So let's say an Irish farmer has a problem with a grant, and the Commission is challenging it. And if they don't get a satisfactory response from the Commission, they can come to me and I'll sort it out. Let's say a young Irish person is looking for a job in the EU, they do a test, they feel they haven't been treated fairly, they can come to us. Let's say people are concerned that the EU hasn't looked into what they consider to be an infringement of EU law or EU policy in relation to the environment in Ireland or some other country. We don't look into the alleged infringement itself, but we look into to see what the Commission has done about it. We also get complaints that relate to migration and asylum and that, insofar as the European Border Agency or the European Asylum and Support System Office might be involved. So it's a very broad range of issues. Also a lot of what we call in Ireland freedom of information or access to documents here. Yes.
Do you think people know about the Ombudsman's office? Irish people, those cases you mentioned.
I think people who need to know do know, but I mean, when I came in, I knew the office fairly well, because having been National Ombudsman in Ireland for 10 years, I was part of the network, which is chaired by the European Ombudsman. And I knew that, my strategy was to do investigations on my own initiative, which is one of the powers that I have, and try and help people in relation to the good administration of the EU, even if they've never heard of me or of the Office of the European Ombudsman. And that has been successful. We've done a number of strategic investigations in relation to many important issues, and as a result of that, the visibility of the office increased, and we've had a huge increase in the number of complaints that we've got. So it's almost like the trickle-down impact. So when I came into office, I had 3 words I used, I think my colleagues were bored eventually hearing me using them, but visibility, impact and relevance. And I think I increased all 3 things in the office over the last 5 years.
And in terms of going forward, what do you think, before I actually ask you that, I want to go back to the work you were doing on, for example, Mr. Barroso. How difficult is it to investigate, we'll say, an issue that concerns one of the big political groups here, because potentially that could have impacted on your re-election?
Well, potentially it did, I guess. Well, in a way, not difficult, because I remember there was one particular case I dealt with in Ireland that became political, not because of anything I had done myself, but because of the way it had been politicised externally. And when I investigated that, I mean, I was asked sort of a similar question: is this not going to sort of, is there not going to be a sort of a fallout for you in relation to that? And I did say, and I know it can sound pious, but I do mean it. I mean, what's the point of being the Ombudsman if you're not going to take on those issues? Then you make yourself weak. And in fact, even though, of course, there was obviously some backlash in relation to some of those investigations that you mentioned, I think ultimately it strengthened the office, because it showed that, we do, and again, this is a phrase I use here and people tell me I don't really understand it, I do what it says on the tin, I do what I'm supposed to do, and therefore I think people, and citizens in particular, can have confidence in this office, that I'm not political, the office has not been politicised, and that we will work independently.
And what about going forward? What do you see to be the key challenges now over the next 5 years as EU Ombudsman?
Well, in a way, we have to mirror, in a way, the key challenges for the EU. I mean, I've been looking very carefully at what Madame von der Leyen, the new president of the Commission, what she has outlined. I mean, she's described this Commission as a geopolitical Commission, which is kind of interesting, and she's raised, the issues of defence, the issues of migration, the climate crisis, the whole digital economy and all of that. Those are the issues that she wants her people to work on. And by definition, that means that the EU itself is going to be, in a way, less in Brussels and more on the ground in the member states. I think there'll be much more hands-on in relation to some of those issues that we've mentioned. And I think, in terms of making, of monitoring those actions on the sake of the citizens, then the Ombudsman has to be involved in that, to make sure that the administrative actions that accompany that agenda are done properly, appropriately, legally, and in the public interest.
So when you talk about done properly, legally, etc., in what way would they be any different that you'd have to monitor compared with previous times?
Well, I think it's as much in the expansion of the EU and its competences and how it sees its expanded role in the world. I mean, Madame von der Leyen in her letters to the various commissioners and so on, emphasised this, how the globe is changing, and we've seen that certainly over the last 5 years. And the EU needs to keep pace with that. So in a way, of course, I'll be doing the same work, but I think there will be an intensification in some areas. And I think what I always try and do is simply to be helpful. So if there's a small, look, I'm not going to solve climate crisis or, issues with Trump or trade or anything like that. But if there is a small piece within, a small discrete piece within those various areas of work that I can help with, that I can assist, then I will always look for that and do it. For example, even in relation to the climate crisis and the environment, one of the issues that I've been doing a lot of work on is in relation to knowing what the member states behind closed doors in council are doing in relation to these measures. Because whatever they say in public, it's behind the closed doors when they make the laws and decide on the regulations that are going to impact on these areas that is important. The council, which are all of our member states and our ministers who come to Brussels several times a year and debate the laws, it's called, it's the black box. So what I've been trying to do is open that up. I mean, a case we had recently, which in some ways seems minor, but in fact illuminates all of that. Advice that was given by the Commission to people in relation to the effect of certain pesticides on the bee population, biodiversity, the environment, all of that, has basically been stuck in Council for 6 years because they can't agree on it. And obviously there are certain member states who, for their own reasons, are opposing.
And powerful lobbying as well from industries
absolutely.
as well.
But because we don't know, is it Ireland, is it France, is it Hungary? Who
because
is
it's done behind closed doors.
Exactly, and therefore, if we don't know, people like you as journalists or we don't know, and therefore we can't challenge or make accountable the people who are doing it. So you see, in that small way, by opening those small decisions in some ways up, then you're having an impact on the wider issues. And as we go forward, I mean, everybody now talks the talk about climate change and the climate crisis and so on, but as we've seen in Australia recently, when it comes to making hard political decisions, that's a different matter. So the way, as we know, politicians make hard political decisions is when there is sufficient public pressure on them to do so. But if the public remains ignorant of whatever the issue is, then they can't put that pressure on.
And aside from the Green Deal, of course, a huge issue now going forward, particularly for Ireland, will be the trade negotiations with the UK. To what extent can we expect more transparency with these negotiations? Because you know the line always is, well, you have to keep them secret until there's no reason anymore to keep them secret.
I think that has changed. I mean, at the very beginning of my mandate in 2013, 2014, we did a big investigation into the trade negotiations that were then ongoing between the EU and the US, the TTIP negotiations. And as a result of the work that we did, plus pressure from media, from certain member state parliaments and so on, the Commission transformed its trade policy and actually put transparency as one of its key values. And I think we've seen that, certainly in Brexit. Okay, you could argue that that was a special case, but certainly we knew from the EU side what was going on, not so much from the UK side, because, negotiations by definition means compromises, and for a period when Brexit meant Brexit, there could be no compromise, so it was difficult politically for the UK to be open. But I've always said that the trade negotiations will be the real proof of transparency in relation to this ongoing Brexit issue. So we'll continue to monitor that. I met Mr. Barnier last year now, of course, and complimented him on the openness of the negotiations. I think he was pleased with that. So let's see what happens. I'm hopeful.
But do you think? But is that the expectation, that there'll be a lot more transparency about what's being negotiated behind the scenes?
Well, it depends. I mean, obviously, in a way, the Brexit was about the withdrawal deal was about a limited number of issues. Now, once we get into the trade negotiations, the number of issues that are going to be dealt with are hugely expanded, and therefore, some member states during the withdrawal agreement process were, depending on how close they were aligned to the UK, were interested or not interested. But there'd be a lot more interest from individual member states, I think, in these negotiations, because they will impact very much on their own political, economic and business interests.
Okay, well look, Emily O'Reilly, the best of luck over the next 5 years. Congratulations again, and thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you so much.